So this is our sixth workshop. We are going to be working on how to effectively use your sources. And what that means is you are going to be tackling a pretty big research paper, and you're going to be needing to use a lot of sources for that. And there's a lot of different ways to take those sources and work them into your essay. And you really want to try and integrate your sources in as many ways as you can, because that's going to keep it interesting to the reader. It's going to make it less dry. And it's also going to ensure that you're working in your own analysis and your own thoughts and own research into the essay, instead of just, quoting source after source. So we're going to kind of focus on how you make it very rich, and you use your sources in ways that are going to make it really interesting to the reader. And so you probably are familiar already with how you integrate sources. There's really three main ways that you can do that. That's the direct quoting, and that's where you're using the exact words of an author without changing them. There's summarizing, so that's where you're taking an overview of the source's key points and then using that summary to offer your own critique and analysis of it. And then finally, there's paraphrasing, which is when you're basically reworking an author's ideas and turning them into your own words, but you're still giving that source acknowledgement that you're using their work. So let's dive in. Now, you probably are familiar with parenthetical citation. You've probably done this in other essays, but let's go over kind of the guidelines for it so that we can kind of take that and move into how you apply it to all these different ways of integrating your sources. So parenthetical citation specifically means that you're acknowledging your source, where you're putting the page number and the author's name at the end in parentheses. So when you're, for example, directly quoting from a source, you're going to do that. Here's a direct quote right here, where you see it. It's in quotation marks, parentheses at the end, author's last name with the page number, and then the period on the outside. That's pretty standard, basic direct quote. And then if you have a direct quote, but there's no author, you're going to set it up the same way. But then instead, you're going to be using the title, right? So that in this case is an article title. And article titles are known as partial works. So those go in quotation marks. If it was a complete work, like a book, then you would be italicizing that. Another thing to note, that if you're doing a direct quote, and it's a long title that you need to put in parentheses, you're going to want to shorten that to just a few of the first words of the title. Okay, and that's fine. Maybe 3 or 4 words max of the title. And you probably will run into that using like academic journals and things. So you do not want to include the whole title when it's a long one. And then you're going to follow the same rules for parenthetical citations when you're paraphrasing and summarizing. The only difference is obviously you're not going to have the quotation marks. So it's going to look something like this bottom one here, where it says the author explores the consequences of not paraphrasing in an essay, Smith 109, period. Same kind of format, just no quotation marks happening. And also just always remember that period's going on the outside of the parentheses at the end of your in-text citation. And that's different than, where a period would normally appear if you were, say, just quoting something without a parenthetical citation. This is the only case where a period should appear outside of quotation marks. All right. Right, so depending on the structure of your sentence, your parenthetical citation is maybe going to look different, right? So for example, if you're going to be writing a sentence where you mention the author or the title, you do not need to, again, include the author's name at the end in the parenthetical citation. You just need to include the page number. So as you see here, because the author is stated, Marx proposes 10 major points in the Communist Manifesto, you have the author's name, you also have the article title or the book title. So you really only need to include the page number in the parenthetical citation. And then the same thing. So if you don't have a page number, you don't have to include that. but you still want to make sure you include the author's name in the parentheses. Okay, so those are a few different structures of how you might put together a parenthetical citation depending on what's included in your actual sentence. And then also note, if you acknowledge the author or the text title in the actual sentence, then you might end up with no parenthetical citation. And that's known as in-text acknowledgement. So that is just another form of acknowledging your source. That is a correct way to do it. So we'll dive into in-text acknowledgement a little bit more in a minute. Okay, so on to varying your integration. So if you're going to just be including, let's say, quotes over and over again with the parenthetical citation at the end, that's going to make for a very dry essay. And it's also going to create some what's known as dropped quotes. So you really don't want to do too many quotes where it's just the direct quote and then the parenthetical citation at the end. You want to vary your integration. So what does that mean? So you're going to want to vary the verbs, your source. You don't want to just be repeating says over and over again. You know, Smith says that, or Hannity says that. Instead, change up the verbs to introduce those sources. I have a box here with a bunch of different options, such as acknowledges, discloses, implies. There's a bunch of different ways that you can introduce your source instead of just says or according to. So really try and change that up. And then on top of that, another thing that you want to do to vary it is the placement of those identified tags, which are also called signal phrases. You may have heard that as well. And that means instead of just always putting, Smith states at the beginning, you can put it in the middle. You can put it at the end even. Here's a few examples where it's set up in different ways, where the signal phrase is coming in at different times in the sentence. And that's perfectly acceptable to do. And it makes it more interesting to the reader. At the bottom there is also another thing that you probably will end up doing, which is a quote within a quote. And as you see, you're going to have to use a single quote and then a double quote at the end to signify where the quote is within the quote. So make a note of that. You'll want to make sure that you're identifying the source, and then within that source, you're stating who has made that quoted statement. In this case, it's Rumspringa, and then they have the quoted material there. Okay. Okay, so on to how you actually, if you're going to be direct quoting, there's a few rules that you want to follow. So you really want to have a good reason for using a direct quote. Otherwise, you want to paraphrase or summarize. Your professor has specifically said he doesn't want to see, too many direct quotes happening. He wants to see you varying things with paraphrasing and summaries instead. But there may be cases where a direct quote is really the only way that you're going to get the content you want across to the reader. So for example, some good reasons to use direct quotes would be the meaning of the original statement would be lost if you were to reword it, or the original statement uses really strong or vivid language that you want that reader to see. Or if you're quoting an original term or phrase, if it's some kind of academic journal, they might be using terminology that they've, either created or is very obscure. In that case, you want to use that original term or phrase that's appearing in the journal. And then do not allow quotes to speak for themselves. This happens a lot where students will do that dropped quote. They're just basically, that means that they just make a quote appear in the middle of, say, a paragraph without introducing the reader to why you're including that quote. So really, you want your research paper to be communicating your ideas, and then the quotes are to help support your ideas. So you don't want to just be stringing other people's ideas together. That's not the goal of your research paper. And then after you provide a quote, the other step you want to make sure you always do is to analyze the quote, right? So you want to explain to the reader why you're including that quote, its significance to your argument, and also that you understand the quote and why it's even appearing in this research essay. And then finally, similar thing, do not use quotes as padding. That happens a lot where you're just Maybe you're just trying to fill up space, or you're not quite sure what else to put somewhere. Don't use quotes as a filler to take up that space. That's not going to benefit your research paper or your grade. Okay, so how to actually integrate a quote. Like I said, you don't want a quote to appear as a dropped quote. And this first example here shows you what a drop quote looks like. So here we have, for the Amish, the public school system represents a problem. A serious problem confronting Amish society from the viewpoint of the Amish themselves is the threat of absorption into mass society through the values promoted in the public school system. So that's a dropped quote because it's basically not conveying why you're including this quote. It's just appearing out of nowhere. Whereas the quote down here is integrated into your own ideas. So it says, for the Amish, the public school system is a problem because it represents the threat of absorption into mass society. So you see how that's clearer to the reader what the point you're making is and why you're including that quote. So another thing to remember is your professor, you can do longer quotes, and that's something like 3 lines or more, but your professor has said to avoid that specifically because they have a tendency to take over an essay, and they end up really not helping convey your own thoughts. And he says it rarely works. So really you want to stay away from anything longer than 3 lines of your essay. And for that reason, I'm not going to go into how to do block quoting because he was pretty specific about not wanting that. But just know that if a quote ever does appear, if you use this in other classes, but if a quote is more than 4 lines of an essay, then you do need to do block quoting, which is an indented quote and is structured a little bit differently. So just make a note to that for future reference. Okay. So on to integrating paraphrasing. So paraphrasing, right, is when you're taking the source material and using your own words to convey that idea to the reader. And with paraphrasing, you really need to make it clear what is being referenced, and you need to make sure that that citation is clear and where the source material is appearing within your essay. So here's some examples to show you a difference between something that's paraphrased is well integrated and a paraphrase that is not well integrated. So this first one, let's have a read and see if you can tell which part is from the writer of the passage and what part came from the source. So art can be used to uncover many problems that children have at home, in school, or with their friends. For this reason, many therapists use art therapy extensively. Children's views of themselves in society are often reflected by their art style. For example, a cramped, crowded art style using only a portion of the paper shows their limited role. Okay, so you can see that it is not clear here where the writer's ideas start and end and where the source's ideas start and end. So you need to make sure that in your writing, you're making that clear to the reader. So in this second version, let's have a read and see if in this one you can tell where it's the writer and where it's the source material. So art can be used to uncover many problems that children have at home, in school, or with their friends. For this reason, many therapists use art therapy extensively. According to William Ashler, in Art and Self-Image, children's views of themselves in society are often reflected by their art style. For example, a cramped, crowded art style using only a portion of the paper shows their limited role. Okay, so you can tell here because the writer uses according to signal the start of something from the source, and then they include that citation at the end as well. So you can see the difference here in where you're identifying the source material. And that's really important because if you don't do this, then you could really kind of dwell into, the world of plagiarism. And you don't want to risk that kind of thing. You want to just make sure you're citing your sources as completely as you possibly can. All right, so how to integrate summarizing. So summarizing is a little bit different because you're condensing an idea from a source and you're putting that into your own words, right? So the reason that you would summarize sources in your paper would be to analyze or critique the ideas that's presented by the author. So what you want to do with summarizing is you want to put some of it in your own words, but you also want to present the author's own actual language to show that what they're saying, they really were saying what you say they were saying, kind of. So in other words, to capture the source's ideas, you really want to kind of mix it with paraphrasing, with quotes, and with your own ideas. So here's a good example. I'm not going to read this whole text because it's long, unnecessary, but let's just say this is an original text that we could summarize that has to do with diabetes in children. And it gives a lot of facts, a lot of information. But maybe you as the writer only need elements of this, and you only need the reader to understand certain ideas from this source material. So it's your job to summarize that source material in a way that the reader is going to understand how it supports your argument and your framing of it. So let's have a look. So here would be an ineffective summary because it's list-like, right? So the author says that only 5% of children had type 2 diabetes before 1994. In addition, they mentioned that today, at least 30% of new childhood diabetes cases in the USA are type 2. They also say that more money is being spent to treat diabetes now, $100 billion a year. So that's just really listing a bunch of facts to the reader. They don't necessarily know what to do with that information. It's your job as the writer to really take this list of information and turn it into something where it's either supporting your argument or possibly you're going to critique it or use it as a way to argue against it. But really, it's your job to tell the reader what they need to know about this source material. So the way that an effective summary would work to do that would be this one. In the article, Don't Blame the Eater, David Smith supports their position on the fast food industry by comparing today's rates of type 2 diabetes to those prior to 1994. Smith makes it clear that instances of type 2 diabetes have increased dramatically, as have the costs of preventing the spread of this disease. So you can really tell how that's an effective summary because it's not just reporting the source information, but it also indicates concisely how the ideas connect and why they matter. Another important thing to note in that second one is that they mention the name of the author and the article. And that's an important way of signaling to your reader that you're referring to someone else's work rather than presenting your own ideas. Again, you want to make sure you do that kind of thing to avoid any, possibility of plagiarizing, whether it's accidentally or not. Just always cover yourself by making sure that you're citing a source every time you're using it. All right. So that really covers kind of the main points about, how to integrate your sources. Does anyone have any questions? All right, I will go ahead and stop my recording.